Thanks for having me here, and I'm really excited to be here. I'd be more than happy to share my journey. I mean, what I was thinking, at least for today, was um, basically giving a brief overview of what my journey was, what led me to today, and giving a little bit of insights in terms of I've done a lot of different things, so giving everyone a bit more of insights in context of what my day to day involves, and then perhaps culminating with some of the lessons that I learned, and what I found was actually really important in this journey, just to give an external viewpoint. Although I'm quite sure that a lot of people will have had similar learnings and shared similar things. So I mean, to begin with, just to give everyone a little bit more of context, I'm Pahini Pandya. Currently, I'm the CEO and co-founder of an AI startup called Panakeia Technologies, which is focused on building AI-driven platforms to accelerate cancer diagnosis. And our idea is to be able to reduce the need for multiple lab-based tests. I'm 32 years old, so somewhere bang in the middle. Have had good amount of experience, but still a long way to go. And in my journey so far, I've come to describe myself as something called an entrepreneurial scientist. Now, those are typically two words that people don't see going together very often, but today I hope to be able to make a case as why this is a unique mindset and something very important to have no matter what route you choose to pursue in life. And I hope that goes towards bringing some light into my reflections on my journey. Um, so before I jump straight into my story, I want everyone to imagine an 8-year-old kid stomping up to its parents with, with a purpose on its mind and hands all on the hips and all matter of factly. And the child is looking up to its parents and saying, I have decided I'm going to be a scientist. That sounds like a fun scene to imagine, but in reality, several years ago, that was me. As an 8-year-old, I was very hyperactive. I was extremely independent. So while growing up, I always wanted to do things on my own, try out things on my own. A good example of it was when I was learning as a child to tie my shoelaces. I'd probably spend hours just trying to figure it out, but I wouldn't let anyone do it for me. I would let them show it to me, but I would not let them do the actual thing because I wanted to learn how to tie my shoelaces on my own. I was also extremely curious. I was always asking questions. I annoyed people, especially my parents, with the amount of times I asked them why, but they were quite patient enough to answer all my questions. Um, and most importantly, I love to experiment. I love to try out new things. If it was something I hadn't done before, I wanted to, go out there and try it for myself. As a result, not very, it's a no-brainer. I was always getting myself, but also the people around me into trouble. So in order to keep me busy, my parents and teachers and even friends had to come up with creative ideas and solutions. So I would channel my energy into things which were productive. One such good instance was when I was in my third grade. When I was 8 years old, my teacher suggested that I participate in a science district level science fair. And the idea that I started playing around with the science fair, because it was my very first, was what project I would do. I started off with a project, with a list of project ideas. Eventually, I settled on doing a science project on dinosaurs. Now, that is very tricky because what do you do for dinosaurs? You can have some sort of posters, you can have some displays, but it's very hard to make it more fun, more interactive, and you're trying to promote science at the same time learning about it yourself. So what I decided to do is convince my project partner, and eventually my arts teacher, my clay modeling teacher, and my science teacher to come up with something really elaborate. What we ended up doing was we created a model, a, a relatively scaled model that people could interact with in real life, of what the Jurassic world would look like. What that meant was we actually had to create models of dinosaurs, which were scaled to size. So hence the clay modeling and sculptures. We had to come up with an understanding of what was the environment like, what were the plants like, what was the temperature like, which our science teacher contributed to, and then we had to work with our arts teacher in terms of making sure that we actually brought that to life. What it also meant was I had to go to garden and pick up some ferns, which were representative of what the ferns would have looked like at that point in time. So this whole activity not only resulted in a life-size interactive demo that people could interact with, but it also helped us in winning the prize. But most importantly, this was my first step where I realized that I had fallen in love with science. Um, and it also made me realize something more was science wasn't just one dimensional. You could bring in a range of different perspectives. You could bring in art, and you could bring in entrepreneurial mindsets to be able to come up with something new, something innovative, and that's what really, really excited me. And that led me to eventually telling my parents that I was going to be a scientist someday. As I grew up, as a teenager, my decision got more and more specific. I was still very sure I wanted to, be a scientist, but I knew that I wanted to work in the medical space. I essentially wanted to create new knowledge, new tools, new techniques, which would help doctors help patients. The reason why I thought was of going that way was because I thought the potential to make an impact was much greater than me trying to be a doctor and helping patients. I would probably help a few thousands of patients in my lifetime, but if I were to create knowledge and tools, I could potentially be impacting millions of patients. I also got more specific in terms of where I wanted to, do my studies. So I knew I wanted to do a PhD, and it had to be from the UK. And as a scientist, I always dreamed of being able to do research at Cambridge. So I had very, very clear goals, and I thought I had a route to getting there. The obvious route was, doing well in academics, doing well in science specifically, um, in order to get the grades needed so I could get admissions to the right sort of university. But as I was going through, I was always this hyperactive person, and I also had similar friends, which meant that I was involved in a lot of extracurricular activities during school. I was lucky enough to be in a school which offered me a range of platforms to be able to engage in activities. I think today there are a lot of platforms which are available both within schools and outside schools, so you don't necessarily need to be restricted and wait for someone to offer you an opportunity. As Marcelo, as you were saying, there are a lot of opportunities out there for kids to get involved in things such as, signing up for the run. Um, I think there are great opportunities today which were not so prevalent in the days before the internet. Um, but during my school, I participated in a wide range of extracurriculars. I used to participate in debates, declamations. I, even took a stint of being an editor for my school magazine. I used to swim a lot, so I was one of the members of my swim team. I also did a lot of volunteering, just fundraising for charities. And one such charitable initiative involved me swimming across a river in India in a campaign against pollution. Um, Basically, pretty much every activity which was not normal, I at least decided I would try it out before I gave my verdict. Um, During my undergrad, this ability to participate and be curious in different things really, really helped me because I picked a biotech undergraduate degree to do in a university which was miles away from my place. What it essentially meant was I had to figure out ways in a new city where I was living alone, had no friends, did not speak the local language, of how to integrate and how to, um, uh, thrive, not just survive, right? The reason why I picked this specific degree was because I thought it was broad enough to give me a good foundation to pursue specific uh, niche areas of research in the future. So, in terms of biotech, my first year involved me learning a wide variety of subjects, of course, with a bigger focus on science, but something like biology, chemistry, to mathematics, statistics, before I, then progressed into more specific biotech related subjects, such as molecular biology. Um, but I continued my extracurricular activities, so which really, really helped me settle in the city. So during this time, I took up tennis, which meant I got a whole bunch of new friends who, you know, took me to different sightseeing trips, helped me understand the city a bit better. This tennis group was actually very critical in helping me figure out how to get around the city by myself, because the public transport wasn't as great. And I did not know how to speak the local language when when going in a bus. So that was quite challenging. I wrote articles for the college magazine. I participated, as usual, in science fairs, and eventually, progressed to even organizing some of the biggest science fairs in the city. Um, During this time, I was also exploring what I wanted to do ahead. And I thought it would be a good idea to do a master's before I jumped straight into a PhD, because I wanted to understand what it meant to do a research project which was very focused, very niche, and which was over a much longer period of time. So I decided, keeping in line with my goal of doing PhD in the UK, I decided I wanted to do a master's in the UK. And I wanted to do my master's from King's College London in biophysics, because first it was different from what I had done. It pushed me out of my comfort zone, because biophysics was something I had very briefly explored during my undergrad. It seemed exciting, but at the same time, it wasn't an area that I knew enough about, and it was a good opportunity to learn. Um, and most importantly, I picked King's for it because I was very inspired by the work that Rosalind Franklin had done on the DNA, and she was one of my role models growing up. So I applied for the program, and when I was actually applying for masters, I realized one big thing: it was very, very expensive to come to the UK. And the reality was, I would likely have to get a scholarship in order to be able to pursue my studies. And I had to apply for scholarships as well, in addition to just applying for the programs, um, which was a great experience. But what it also made me realize was, this time I was not just competing with, students from my region. I wasn't competing with students from my locality. I was competing with students from all over the world. Um, and I was initially pretty stumped at what would make me stand out. I was pretty normal. I didn't have crazy achievements, like attending the West when I was a teenager. That was, but yeah, what I did realize was that I had a plethora of extracurricular activities which I participated in. And I realized the breadth of experience I had was something which not a lot of people had. So I used that to help me stand out in my applications, which obviously meant I ended up getting a scholarship, and I was able to pursue my master's at King's in the UK. Now, my master's at King's was quite an interesting one. It was a combination of a practical program and a theoretical program. So I pursued a degree called MRes, and that was intentional. It meant I had to spend 3 months doing uh, class-based learning, as well as the scientific practicals that you go through. But the remaining 9 months of the course was a research project. What this meant was it was typically longer than most of the research projects I had done. It gave me an experience of, figuring out what projects I could do, and at the same time give a lot more freedom to experiment and do things which I may not have done in the past. Um, so that was a great experience. Again, I decided to push myself out of my comfort zone, and I picked up a project in nuclear magnetic resonance, NMR. Um, and that was something I had never studied before. It was something I had just explored in some of the theory lessons, but it was quite fascinating to me. And I wanted to apply the technology to cancer diagnosis. So that's where that was my first foray into this space. The reason why I had chosen cancer was because I had lost a very close childhood friend to the disease just a few years earlier. Um, Following my master's, I was still not 100% sure what was the space I wanted to do my PhD in because it's a long commitment and PhDs can be difficult. So I applied to be a research technician at King's College London, which allowed me to get some more relevant experience in the space of cancer research. Um, what I tried to do was I tried to look for positions which allowed me to have a little bit of research experience rather than just focusing on giving more technical basic support. So I ended up working with a group leader who wanted to set up her lab from scratch. What that meant was we essentially had to design what the lab would look like, what were the things we would need in the lab. Then we had to sit and look at the research that she had done in the past that she wanted to carry out in the future. And then figure out what were some of the key questions from her past research that were interesting enough that we needed to answer. That was my first foray into proper research. And following those questions, we started building these hypotheses or assumptions, saying, okay, I have this question around cancer cells and around how they spread across the body. Now, my role was to then figure out what were some of the experiments that we could do and actually do those experiments to test whether cancer cells spread through the body in a particular way or if it was a different way. What this meant was it opened up a lot of different questions, further questions, which eventually went and became different projects in the lab. What this experience also provided me was an insight into the commercial aspects of research, something which I wasn't intentionally looking for, but I just bumped into it, such as financial planning. So I was involved in budgeting, monitoring our spending, and the cash flow, and predicting what our future budgets would be again. And I was also involved in procurement and purchasing, so working and building relationships with our suppliers, negotiating discounts, and things like that. These were very interesting and very useful, although they did not seem super useful skills at this time. Following this experience, of course, I wanted to do a PhD. I was very certain of that. I applied for several different positions, got multiple offers with scholarships, which was one big criteria for me. Um, I eventually decided to do a PhD in the same lab where I was doing my research technician position because I realized it gave me the biggest freedom to pick and choose what my PhD project was and to have a much bigger say in terms of how I could drive it. I realized that it was one of the things, being an independent person, I wanted to have a good say in what I did. So that worked quite well for me. It also meant that I ended up having a very multidisciplinary PhD in a lab which was initially very cell biology focused, meaning it looked at cancer cells and understood how those cells work. I made it more into a biophysics focused PhD, meaning which meant that I tried to understand how cancer cells interacted with their physical environment around that, converted the signals from the physical environment into chemical or biochemical signals, and then how these drove long-term changes so that the cancer cells could eventually, again, physically alter their environment in order to be able to move and spread across the body. What this meant was it allowed us to identify a whole range of targets which can be leveraged in the clinic, but they also a whole range of targets which can help us diagnose cancer patients better so that they can be treated better in the clinic. In terms of day to day, my job mostly involved was pretty similar to what I did as a research technician, uh, where I focused more on the research side, where I identified what were the key questions I wanted to answer, come up with some assumptions on what could be the possible answers, and then create experiments to either test those assumptions or disprove the assumptions. So you could either validate them or disprove them. And it was a continuous cycle of either failures or successes, which I had to deal with on a daily basis. To give you a bit more flavor of what my day to day work involved, I would grow cells in containers. These are human cancer cells, which you can grow in containers. You feed them food. Pretty similar to taking care of a pet. If you don't feed them, they don't grow, they don't live, they die. So they require day-to-day care. And then when you do your experiments, one of the experiments which I did was I would put them on top of matrices, which were similar to your skin. So they would mimic what your skin would look like. I would put the cancer cells on top of the artificial setup, and then I would let them grow for a bit and then treat some of the cells with drugs to see whether they responded or not. I would then take pictures of these artificial setups and then figure out whether the cells were responding. So I would have to analyze the images, extract the data, and it could be something as simple as how many cancer cells are there in a specific image to something more complicated. And then I would analyze these results. I would, put them into nice graphs or, create figures with pictures that I had taken and then present them in front of my lab more on a weekly basis. But I would then, once I had done a series of different experiments and you had a short story to tell, I would share them with the wider scientific community, either within my departmental meetings, so where I would have presentations, or where I would give presentations at much bigger conferences. Following my PhD, I pursued a short postdoc at the University of Cambridge. During this time at Cambridge, my work focused on lung cancer. So the idea was very similar, but I was looking at how different genetic makeups of lung cancers cause them to behave differently and react to different drugs differently. And my project was to identify new ways or new models that we could use to test out these genetic changes and see if we could find any therapeutic targets in the long run. So the work was very comparable to what I had done during my PhD. It had given me a great, great foundation to be able to pursue a career in research. But during my PhD, I had a nagging realization that while my research was translational, it would help doctors in the future. But the reality was that future was very far. It was probably 50 years down the line. And what I wanted was an impact that I could see within my lifetime. So naturally, being me, I started to question if there were ways to accelerate the transition of this research into real world applications. What that was that I did what I knew the best. I got involved in a whole range of extracurricular activities again. So I got involved in a range of organizations, which allowed PhDs and postdocs to get involved in entrepreneurship, which allowed me to understand what it takes to, build a startup. I worked with several different startups. I dabbled a little bit in consulting and policy making as well. And eventually I found that the most appropriate route for me to go was to found my own startup. During my PhD, I also had my own personal cancer scare, and I had to wait for a whole month before getting an all clear. And that event was essentially an accelerator event for me because I had seen the challenges in cancer research, and I had seen the challenges of potentially being a cancer patient. And I really, really wanted to bridge the gap because I knew that technology, the knowledge was there, it was just not being translated fast enough. So I founded Panakeia with my co-founder. Um, and what we are now, as I mentioned, what we are now working on is building AI driven solutions. So essentially creating a set of digital tools which could help streamline the cancer care process, make the diagnostic process more accurate, more efficient, without the need for lab based tests, because it takes a long, long, long time to get multiple complex lab tests done. Um, Now, my journey into startup was pretty similar to my PhD and my postdoc, where I spent a lot of time just exploring what are the big problems in cancer diagnosis, coming up with key questions or key problems that we wanted to solve, coming up with potential assumptions on how we could solve these problems. That's basically how I came up with the idea. It was a bit more structured. I realized my PhD had given me a lot of the structural basis that I needed in context of my thinking to be able to take this further. I have been able to translate this approach to a lot of other areas. So on a day-to-day basis, every single thing which comes up where we don't know the answer to, we take an approach where we come up with a few different assumptions and then we just go and experiment and test to see what works, what doesn't work, and it's constantly being iterated and improved upon. So what I did not realize when I was doing a PhD was how critical and how useful the skills that I had during my PhD and my postdoc, and how important they would be in making sure that I was a successful entrepreneur. Um, so beyond the experimentation, I also, leverage skills around communications, around dealing with different types of people with different types of expertise. So during my PhD, I collaborated with a lot of different people. I collaborated with mathematicians, I collaborated with biologists, I collaborated with clinicians and physicists, all of whom spoke a very, very different language. And it was my job during my PhD to make sure that I could communicate what we were trying to solve and bring everybody on the same page. This is pretty much exactly what I do on a day to day basis in my role as one of the founders of Panakeia. I work with different members. I work with ML scientists, ML engineers, pathologists who are clinicians. I work with investors, I work with clinical decision makers, so hospital management, for instance, to bring them all on the same page, communicate to them what we are doing in a simple, clear manner, and making sure that everybody understands what we are doing, what the next steps are, and are able to raise the right sort of questions. I also leveraged some of the financial experience that I had as a research associate. It gave a very good kickstart in terms of, when we were fundraising for Panakeia to be able to do the budget, the planning, and the forecasting in a more structured manner. It was something completely unexpected, but I was able to use it and leverage it in a very nice way. I also leveraged some of the grant writing expertise that I had built during my PhD and my postdoc in order to apply for funding for Panakeia. Because we're a deep tech startup, we not only fundraise from investors, but we also tend to apply for very specific research focused grants. And that's where my grant writing expertise came in to help quite a lot. So throughout this journey, I'm conscious of the time, so I'll say throughout this journey, I've learned several things, and I would say this is where the reflection is where I gained my wisdom, and I hope to be able to accelerate your journey through that. The key things that I learned are first one being explore. Try out new things. I wouldn't have been here had I not said yes to a wide variety of extracurricular activities that I participated in. In some cases, I was forced by my friends or my parents to consider them, but I did, and I'm glad that I participated in them. Today, I wish I could have participated in a lot more activities than I did. I would say be curious. I always ask why. I always wanted to understand the depth of the things. And it is super, super important. Having a mindset where you are constantly exploring and questioning things is super, super helpful in no matter what route you go down. Persevere. I think this is the most important one. In reality, you can't choose what you're given in life, but you can choose what you do with it. I wouldn't have been here. I wouldn't have achieved my dream of, doing a PhD from the UK, being a scientist and a researcher at Cambridge, had it not been for my perseverance. Although I didn't, talk about it in much detail, I did face multitude of challenges on my way here. Um, but every single time, having a goal, having some sort of a focus, really helped me align myself and find creative ways of getting to the goal that I needed to get to. Of course, with challenges, it means that with challenges comes downsides. Also, sometimes there are failures. And what I would say is, I think which was something which was already mentioned before, is be positive. I think it's very important to have a mindset of handling both successes and failures um, in a moderate fashion. Don't get too disappointed and don't get too excited, especially in context of failures. And this is something I'm learning even today is focus on what you can learn out of it. What were the key lessons? If something didn't work, ask why it didn't work and what could you do next time to make it work or to improve it better. This is something which was completely reiterated throughout my PhD and has now become a mindset for me. But being positive is not easy and you can't do it alone. So make sure you have a good network of friends, a very strong support system, whether that's your family, whether that's your friends, that can pull you through. I succeeded in a lot of my endeavors, not because I was good at something or I was exceptional at something. It was because I made everything a group activity. Um, and from my science project, where I dragged in not only my project partner but my teachers as well into helping us out. I've made sure that everything I did, I always had support and I always worked with a team. This is something which drives me even in my startup today. So, um, you know, on a day to day basis, I have to convince people who I don't know, who I've never worked with before, to come and work with us because they have this unique, exceptional talent that could help make our startup a big success and that could actually help us deliver the impact that we want to deliver. Of course, it also means that, we are on a route which is incredibly challenging and to convince other people to take up challenges which they not necessarily may be ready for is something extremely difficult. So yeah, make sure to have the right sort of people who help you build these right sort of teams in no matter what you do. One of the other things that I realized and more recently have become even more conscious of is don't be afraid to ask. Growing up as a teenager, I realized that I used to ask people for a lot of things. I used to ask. I was never afraid to reach out to people and ask them questions or ask them for help. As we grow up, we often tend to have preconceived notions. We often tend to have, these notions that people might not want to help. Um, we never know till we ask them. And time and again, I've been proven wrong where I've just reached out to people asking for some help, not expecting anything in return because what's the worst they can do? They'll say a no, and that's that. And more often than not, I've been surprised at how willing people have been to help us get to where we wanted to get to. So as a result, I've made it a point to help, to give back and to actually help people anytime they ask me an area where I can be of help. So, I mean, and this is open in case if there's anything I can help with, or if I can shed light on any specific areas, I'd be more than happy to do so post the talk. And finally, I would say today is better than doing it never. So if you want to do something, if you haven't done something, do it today. Don't wait for tomorrow. And nothing is permanent but change. So don't take yourself or your failures too seriously. Things will change. Things will come up. And all in all, I think these are some of the key things which make for an entrepreneurial scientist mindset, which I do hope is something of help today. Yeah, and I'll stop there, Marcelo. I'm conscious I'm over time. Brilliant. Thanks so much for having me.
It's your pleasure. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay.